Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're challenging everything you might think you know about how global conflicts are truly won and lost. Because when we think about the great wars of the 20th century, our minds naturally go straight to massive troop movements, overwhelming firepower, and giant battlefield clashes. But today, we're pulling back the curtain. So let's jump right in with a question that kind of flips our traditional understanding of military might totally on its head. Ask yourself, what actually are the greatest weapons of war? We've all been conditioned to answer that with a list of things like tanks, aircraft carriers, or atomic bombs. But history? Well, it tells a much more complex and a much quieter story. The truth is, the most decisive elements of war often took place completely in the shadows, using deeply unconventional means. We're not talking about heavy artillery here. We're talking about things like rubber and air, ancient spoken languages, sheer psychological endurance, and rudimentary computing. To unpack this hidden arsenal, here is our roadmap for today. First, the art of deception. Then, unbreakable native codes. Third, the last to surrender. And finally, cracking the Soviet cipher. Let's get to it. Part 1. The art of deception, the Ghost Army. Take a look at this stark contrast. On one side, you've got your standard military force armed with deadly weapons. But on the other, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, who were armed entirely with creativity and illusion. Officially activated in 1944, this was a tiny unit of only about 1,100 men. And instead of typical infantry, the Army was literally recruiting from art schools and advertising agencies in New York and Philly. They brought in architects, actors, set designers, and sound engineers. This phrase right here perfectly captures their vibe. They put on what was essentially a traveling roadshow. They executed over 20 massive theatrical deception campaigns against Axis forces all across Europe, from Normandy all the way to the Rhine River. Their entire goal? Just completely mislead the German army about the size and location of the actual Allied forces. And the tactics they used to pull this off are just wild. The visual deception was run by the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, who set up inflatable tanks, cannons, and airplanes. Get this, they purposefully camouflaged them imperfectly so that enemy aerial recon would be sure to spot them. Meanwhile, you had the sonic deception crew mixing sound effects of massive armored units onto state-of-the-art wire recorders. Pumping that audio through giant amplifiers mounted on half-tracks, it could be heard 15 miles away. They completely fooled the enemy. Moving on to part 2, unbreakable native codes, the code talkers. Shifting from visual tricks to linguistic secrecy, we hit a deeply respectful and, for decades, totally untold piece of history. Now, you've probably heard of the famous Navajo code talkers, right? But the scope is actually much wider than that. American Indians have a proud history of serving in the armed forces at a higher percentage rate than literally any other group. This includes 49 members of the Assiniboine and Sioux tribes from the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, who utilize their unique cultural traditions to aid the military in the most critical way imaginable. These soldiers essentially weaponized their native languages. Because these languages were incredibly complex and entirely unwritten in standard military dictionaries, they were able to create a completely secure, unbreakable battlefield communication network. While mechanical codes were being cracked left and right across the globe, these tribal languages completely baffled enemy intelligence and ultimately saved countless lives. But honestly, the most astounding part of this whole story is this number right here, 60. At the end of World War II, these heroes were sworn to absolute silence. They kept their incredible secret for 60 years. It wasn't until the 2008 Code Talkers Recognition Act that many of these men and their families finally received the congressional gold medals they so deeply deserved. Which brings us to part 3, the last to surrender, Japanese holdouts. Now, shifting from the quiet stoicism of the code talkers, we enter a really profound story of psychological isolation found deep in the jungles of the Pacific Theater. Let's define exactly what we mean here. Zanryu Nipponhei translates to remaining Japanese soldiers. These were incredibly loyal men of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy who just flat out refused to stop fighting long after the global conflict had ended in September 1945. I mean, really think about it. Why would someone stay in a brutal, equatorial jungle for years? Well, isolated from the world, these holdouts survived for decades due to a crazy mix of factors. Some completely lacked accurate information, genuinely believing the news of Japan's surrender was just Allied propaganda. Others feared execution if captured, But for many, they were just driven by an unyielding sense of duty and a strict military honor code that forbade surrender under absolutely any circumstances. Just look at this timeline. It is absolutely shocking. It maps out a decades-long persistence. World War II ends in 1945, right? But then you see Yuichi Akatsu giving up in 1950, which is wild enough. But look down at 1972, when Shoichi Yokoi was captured. And then 1974, 29 years after the war ended, the last confirmed holdout, Private Teruo Nakamura, finally emerged. To really wrap your head around the incredible human element here, consider the story of Lieutenant Hiro Onoda. He survived in the jungles of the Philippines for 28 years. He absolutely refused to lay down his arms, treating every single search party as an enemy patrol. The guy only stood down in 1974 when the Japanese government literally tracked down his aging former commanding officer and flew him to the island to personally give Onoda the formal order to relieve him of duty. And finally, Part 4. Cracking the Soviet Cipher, Project Venona. Stepping into the dawn of the Cold War information age, we're looking at cryptographic warfare and the deepest levels of American counterintelligence. During the war, the Soviets used this system called a one-time pad. As you can see in these steps, it was believed to be mathematically unbreakable. You take a plain text message, mix it with a totally random sequence of numbers from a physical pad, send it, and the receiver uses an identical pad to decrypt it. Because the numbers are random, it's theoretically impossible to crack. But here's the catch. That only works if that one-time pad is truly used just once and then destroyed immediately. But, humans make mistakes. And catching those mistakes was the whole point of Project Venona, launched in 1943. Initiated by Jean Grabiel, who, incredibly, was a retired school teacher, this brilliant team operated out of a cramped, plywood-screened room at Arlington Hall. Made up largely of civilian women and military personnel, they tirelessly analyzed punch cards for years, searching for the tiniest mathematical overlaps where the Soviets might have accidentally reused a one-time pad. This team meticulously sorted through thousands of intercepted telegraphic cables. And as you can see here, as their knowledge expanded, they managed to categorize these intercepts into 5 distinct communication systems, sorting out everyday trade messages from the really high-level KGB and military intelligence communications. By finding those rare overlaps and breaking this impossible code, Venona pulled off something historic. They ended up exposing the infamous atomic spy ring embedded deep within the highly classified Manhattan Project. The decrypts revealed the cover names of operatives who were passing nuclear secrets straight to Moscow, which directly led to the identification of Klaus Fuchs, Julius Rosenberg, and several others. The sheer scale of this shadow war is just staggering. Before the project wrapped up in 1980, Venona cryptoanalysts had deciphered roughly 2,900 messages. And what they found inside those messages revealed that 349 American citizens and immigrants had been actively recruited to spy for the Soviet Union. It fundamentally changed our whole understanding of how deeply espionage had penetrated the American home front. So when we step back and look at all these incredible stories, it becomes pretty clear that the greatest battles of these global conflicts weren't always fought with guns and bombs. The true arsenal of the 20th century relied on the quiet power of secrets. It relied on artists creating phantom armies, Native Americans utilizing their ancient languages, isolated men bound by unyielding honor, and brilliant minds sitting in cramped rooms cracking impossible codes. To wrap up our explainer today, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. If it took decades to declassify the Ghost Army, 60 years to recognize the code talkers, 30 years to find the last Japanese holdout, and 50 years to reveal Project Venona, what hidden mechanisms, what grand deceptions, and what unbroken codes are operating in the world around us right now, just waiting for history to uncover them? Something to think about. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and keep your curiosity sharp.